The avoidant person is experiencing a moment of recognition that is more devastating and more psychologically disruptive than any of the other realizations they've had about losing you. They're recognizing that they didn't just end a relationship or create distance from someone who cared about them, but that they actually destroyed your heart, that they broke something in you that was whole when you met them, that they took someone who was open and trusting and loving and left that person wounded and guarded and fundamentally changed in ways that are their responsibility and their fault. This recognition is different from simply knowing they hurt you or understanding intellectually that breakups cause pain. This is visceral, undeniable awareness that they were the instrument of genuine harm, that your heart, which you offered to them with vulnerability and hope, was damaged by their patterns, their withdrawal, their inability to receive what you were giving, their choice to push away what you were offering. The avoidant person is seeing evidence of this destruction in ways they cannot ignore. Perhaps they're witnessing your transformation from open to closed, seeing how you've developed walls and defenses you didn't have before, recognizing that the trust and the vulnerability you once possessed so naturally are now things you protect carefully and offer sparingly, if at all. Perhaps they're hearing from mutual friends about your struggles to trust again, about your difficulty opening to new relationships, about the ways their treatment of you created wounds that are taking time and work to heal. Perhaps they're seeing your pain directly through a conversation or an encounter that reveals how deeply they affected you, how much damage their patterns created, how you're not the same person you were before them because their behavior fundamentally altered your relationship to love and trust and vulnerability. This recognition that they destroyed your heart is shattering to the avoidant person because it forces confrontation with their impact that their defensive system has been working to avoid, because it makes undeniable their responsibility for causing genuine harm to someone innocent who was trying to love them, because it reveals that their patterns are not just protecting themselves, but are actively damaging others, and because it creates guilt and shame that cannot be easily rationalized away through their usual defensive strategies of minimizing harm or blaming circumstances or focusing on incompatibility. They broke something precious, and they know it. And this knowing is changing everything about how they see themselves and what they did. The delayed recognition that shatters their defensive narrative. The avoidant person's recognition that they destroyed your heart is delayed recognition, coming not during the relationship or immediately after its ending, but later, sometimes much later, when distance and time have allowed certain truths to surface and when evidence of the destruction has accumulated in ways that make it undeniable. Understanding how this delayed recognition occurs and why it's so devastating reveals both the mechanisms of the avoidant self-deception and the power of the truth when it finally breaks through their defenses. The recognition is delayed because during the relationship and immediately after its ending, the avoidant person's defensive system was actively working to minimize their awareness of the harm they were causing. When they were withdrawing from you, when they were hot and cold, when they were treating you inconsistently or ending things, they couldn't allow themselves to fully see or feel the impact this was having on you because that awareness would create guilt and shame their defensive system was organized to prevent. So they minimized the harm in real time. They told themselves you were strong enough to handle their patterns. They convinced themselves you'd be fine, that you'd move on quickly, that the hurt was temporary and not that severe. They focused on their own discomfort and their own need for distance rather than on your experience of pain and confusion. This minimization during the actual events protected them from having to sit with the weight of what they were doing, allowing them to maintain their patterns without the emotional cost of fully acknowledging their impact. The recognition is also delayed because the avoidant person's defensive narrative about the relationship and its ending actively prevented them from seeing the destruction they caused. They constructed stories that made their behavior seem reasonable or necessary. You were incompatible, you wanted different things, the timing wasn't right, you were too demanding, they needed space to focus on themselves. These narratives frame the ending as unfortunate but inevitable, rather than as a result of their patterns destroying something that could have worked. Within these narratives, there was no room for recognizing that they destroyed your heart because the destruction wasn't part of the story they were telling themselves. The story was about necessary distance or about relationships that don't work out, not about someone causing genuine harm to another person who was innocent and who was trying to love them well. But time and distance have eroded these defensive narratives and have allowed different truth to emerge. The avoidant person is now far enough removed from the immediate situation that they can begin to see it more clearly without the active defensive distortion that characterized their perception during the relationship. They're encountering information or evidence that contradicts their minimizing narrative and forces more honest reckoning with what happened and what they caused. Perhaps they're seeing you now and recognizing how different you are, how much more guarded, how the openness and the trust you possessed are visibly diminished or transformed into protective distance. Perhaps they're hearing about your struggles from mutual friends who aren't sugarcoating the impact the relationship had on you. Perhaps they're reflecting on specific moments they remember differently now, seeing in retrospect how much pain you were in that they couldn't or wouldn't see at the time. The recognition that they destroyed your heart comes when the avoidant person can no longer maintain the comfortable fiction that you were fine or that the relationship's ending was clean or mutual or about simple incompatibility. They're forced to confront that you were genuinely harmed, that your heart was broken not through normal relationship ending, but through their specific patterns of withdrawal and inconsistency and emotional unavailability, that you offered them something pure and vulnerable, and they damaged it through their inability to receive it appropriately. This confrontation is occurring because the evidence is too substantial to ignore, because the passage of time has made their defensive minimizations obviously false, because they're mature enough now or distant enough now to see truth they couldn't see before. The specific moment when recognition fully hits varies, but it often involves witnessing evidence of your transformation from who you were to who you've become in response to being hurt by them. The avoidant person remembers you as open, trusting, warm, emotionally generous, willing to be vulnerable, but they're seeing now that you're guarded, careful, protected in ways you weren't before. Perhaps you're visibly less willing to trust in new relationships. Perhaps you've developed cynicism or weariness about love that wasn't part of your personality before. Perhaps you've built walls that are clearly defensive responses to having been hurt. The contrast between who you were and who you are now is stark enough that the avoidant cannot deny their role in this transformation. They changed you, and not for the better. They took someone whole and left someone wounded. The recognition shatters the defensive narrative because it makes undeniable what the narrative was constructed to hide. That the avoidant person is not just someone with different needs or someone who is protecting themselves, but is someone who caused genuine harm to another human being, someone whose defensive patterns are destructive not just to relationships, but to the people in those relationships. The comfortable story where they were the independent person making rational choices about incompatibility, or where both people were equally responsible for the relationship not working, falls apart when confronted with evidence that one person, you, was genuinely trying to make things work and was genuinely harmed when the other person, them, could not or would not meet that trying with reciprocal effort. The recognition is particularly devastating because it often comes alongside the realization that you were innocent in ways that make the harm they caused even more inexcusable. You weren't perfect, certainly, but you were acting in good faith. You were trying to love them well. You were patient with their patterns. You were understanding of their wounds. You gave them chances they didn't deserve and care they didn't reciprocate. And their response to this innocence, to this genuine attempt to love them, was to hurt you through their patterns, to damage your capacity to trust and to be open, to destroy your heart through their inability to receive what you were offering. This recognition of your innocence and their culpability makes the destruction they caused impossible to rationalize or to dismiss as mutual responsibility or as just how relationships sometimes end. The guilt and shame they cannot escape or rationalize away. The avoidant person's recognition that they destroyed your heart is creating guilt and shame that are qualitatively different from the mild regret or passing discomfort they might have felt about other relationships or other hurts they've caused. This guilt and shame are profound, persistent, and resistant to the defensive mechanisms the avoidant typically uses to manage uncomfortable emotions. Understanding these feelings and why they're so inescapable reveals the depth of the avoidant's internal suffering when they recognize the harm they've caused. The guilt the avoidant experiences is rooted in the recognition that they are directly responsible for genuine harm to someone who didn't deserve it. Guilt is about having done something wrong, having caused harm through your actions or failures to act. The avoidant person is recognizing that they committed wrong against you, not through malice or conscious cruelty, but through their patterns, their defensive behaviors, their inability to show up, their choice to prioritize their comfort over your well-being. They withdrew when you needed presence. They were cold when you needed warmth. They created chaos through inconsistency when you needed stability. They ended things or created distance that broke your heart when you were trying to build something meaningful. All of this happened because of their choices, their patterns, their limitations. And the guilt comes from knowing they cause pain that could have been prevented if they'd been different, if they'd done their healing work, if they'd been capable of receiving what you offered. The guilt is particularly intense because the avoidant person is recognizing that you gave them something rare and precious. Your open heart, your trust, your vulnerability, your love, and they damaged it, destroyed it, treated it carelessly when it deserved care and protection. You trusted them with something valuable and fragile, and they broke it. This is not abstract harm, but is specific betrayal of trust, specific failure to honor what was given to them, specific destruction of something that should have been treasured. The weight of having damaged something so precious is creating guilt that sits heavy and constant, that intrudes on their thoughts, that makes them question themselves and their choices in fundamental ways. The shame the avoidant experiences is distinct from guilt and is even more painful because shame is not just about having done something wrong, but about being fundamentally flawed or bad as person. Shame says not just, I did something bad, but I am bad. The avoidant person is experiencing shame because recognizing they destroyed your heart forces them to confront that they are the kind of person who destroys hearts, who hurts innocent people, whose patterns cause genuine damage to others. This recognition attacks their self-image and their sense of who they are. Many avoidants see themselves as fundamentally good people who are just protecting themselves, who are making reasonable choices about their needs and their boundaries. But destroying someone's heart is not the behavior of good person making reasonable choices. It's the behavior of someone whose dysfunction causes collateral damage, whose patterns hurt others, who needs to change in fundamental ways. The shame is intensified by the avoidant person's recognition that they hurt you using the very vulnerabilities you shared with them, that they exploited your openness and your trust to cause maximum damage. You made yourself vulnerable with them. You showed them your soft parts, your needs, your hopes, your fears. And their response to this vulnerability was to use it as ammunition for their defensive withdrawal, to treat your openness as burden or as pressure, to punish you for having needs by becoming unavailable. This betrayal of vulnerability creates profound shame because it reveals them as unsafe person, as someone who cannot be trusted with another's heart, as someone whose defensive patterns turn gifts into weapons. The shame about this specific betrayal is harder to bear than general relationship regret because it speaks to fundamental untrustworthiness and unsafety in their character. The guilt and shame are resistant to the avoidant person's usual defensive mechanisms for managing uncomfortable emotions. Typically, when avoidants feel guilty or uncomfortable about their behavior, they employ several strategies. They minimize the harm they caused. They blame the other person or circumstances for creating the situation. They rationalize their behavior as justified or necessary. They distract themselves with work or other pursuits. They suppress the feelings through emotional disconnection. But with the recognition that they destroyed your heart, these strategies are failing. The harm is too significant to minimize. They broke someone's heart, altered someone's capacity to trust and love. The blame shifting doesn't work because your innocence and your genuine attempts to make things work are too apparent. The rationalization fails because no amount of incompatibility or need for space justifies destroying someone who was trying to love you. The distraction and suppression are ineffective because the guilt and shame are too profound and too connected to their sense of themselves to be easily set aside. The guilt manifests in intrusive thoughts where the avoidant person cannot stop thinking about specific moments when they hurt you, replaying scenes where they can see now how much pain they caused, remembering your face or your words or your reactions, and recognizing in retrospect what they couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge at the time. These intrusive memories are torture because they force repeated confrontation with their behavior and its impact, making the guilt fresh and raw repeatedly rather than allowing it to fade through time or distance. The avoidant might remember the moment they withdrew when you were reaching for connection, the time they criticized you to create distance, the conversation where they ended things and could see but chose to ignore your devastation. Each memory is evidence of their culpability and their harm. The shame manifests in the avoidant person's changed relationship with themselves, in their inability to maintain the self-image they once held, in their recognition that they are not who they thought they were or who they wanted to be. They thought they were an independent person making conscious choices about their life. They're recognizing their wounded person whose unhealed trauma causes harm to others. They thought they were protecting themselves through reasonable boundaries. They're recognizing they're destroying others through defensive patterns they're too afraid or too lazy to address. This gap between who they thought they were and who they actually are creates shame that colors everything, that makes them question their worth, that forces them to see themselves as someone who hurts people, who can't be trusted with love, who destroys what others build. The guilt and shame are also intensified by the avoidant person's awareness that the destruction they caused is not easily undone, that they cannot simply apologize and make everything okay, that the harm they inflicted will affect you for potentially years to come. They're recognizing that they didn't just cause temporary hurt that will heal with time, but caused potentially lasting damage to your ability to trust, to be vulnerable, to open your heart to love. They changed you in ways that might take extensive therapy and time to heal. And they know that your difficulty trusting in future relationships, your guardedness in situations where you would have been open before, your wounds that will require work to heal, all of this is their doings. The recognition that they caused lasting harm rather than temporary pain makes the guilt and shame almost unbearable because it means their impact will persist long after the relationship has ended, that they will continue to affect your life even in their absence. How this recognition changes their self-perception forever. The avoidant person's recognition that they destroyed your heart is not just creating temporary guilt and shame that will pass with time, but is fundamentally and permanently changing how they see themselves, their patterns, and their relationships. This change in self-perception is occurring because the recognition is so significant and so undeniable that it cannot be integrated into their previous self-understanding without shattering that understanding and forcing construction of new, more honest, and more uncomfortable relationship with who they are. Understanding how their self-perception is changing reveals both the depth of the impact this recognition is having and the possibility, however slim, that this recognition might motivate genuine transformation. The avoidant person's self-perception is changing from seeing themselves as independent person, making rational choices, to seeing themselves as wounded person whose unhealed trauma causes harm to others. This shift is fundamental because it moves them from position of power and agency where they were choosing their independence and their patterns to position of responsibility and limitation where their patterns are revealed as defensive responses to wounds they haven't addressed and as behaviors that harm innocent people. They can no longer maintain the fiction that they're simply someone with different relationship needs or preferences. They're forced to see themselves as someone whose defensive patterns are destructive, whose wounds are controlling their behavior in ways that hurt others, whose lack of healing work is not just personal choice, but is creating collateral damage. This recognition is changing their entire framework for understanding their relationship history and their role in relationship failures. The avoidant person's self-perception is changing from seeing their patterns as protective strategies to seeing them as destructive behaviors that need to change. Throughout their life, the avoidant has understood their withdrawal, their emotional distance, their difficulty with commitment as necessary protection, as ways of keeping themselves safe from the hurt they experienced in childhood or in previous relationships. These patterns felt like self-care, like appropriate boundary setting, like reasonable management of their needs. But recognizing that they destroyed your heart forces different understanding. The patterns that felt protective are revealed as harmful. The boundaries that felt necessary are exposed as walls that prevent genuine connection and that hurt people who try to get close. The protection that felt like strength is shown to be limitation that costs them meaningful relationships and that damages people who care about them. This shift from seeing patterns as protective to seeing them as destructive is profound because it means the avoidant can no longer hide behind the justification that they're just taking care of themselves. They're recognizing they're hurting others through behaviors they can change but haven't been willing to change. The avoidant person's self-perception is changing from seeing themselves as victim of their attachment wounds to seeing themselves as perpetrator of harm due to those same wounds. The avoidant has typically understood themselves through the lens of their childhood experiences as someone who was hurt and who developed defensive strategies in response to that hurt. This narrative cast them as victim and made their patterns understandable as responses to what was done to them. But recognizing that they destroyed your heart shifts the narrative. Yes, they were wounded in childhood. Yes, their patterns developed in response to those wounds. But they're now an adult whose unhealed wounds are causing harm to other people. They've moved from being victim to being perpetrator, from being the one who was hurt to being the one who hurts others. This shift is deeply uncomfortable because it requires taking responsibility and agency rather than remaining in victim position where their behavior is always someone else's fault or is justified by their past. The avoidant person's self-perception is changing from believing they're emotionally intelligent and self-aware to recognizing they've been in denial about their impact and their patterns. Many avoidants, particularly those who've learned about attachment theory, believe they're quite self-aware. They can name their patterns. They can discuss their wounds. They can explain their behavior using psychological language. This intellectual understanding created false sense that they knew themselves well and were managing their patterns consciously. But recognizing that they destroyed your heart while all this supposed self-awareness was occurring reveals that the intellectual knowledge was not the same as genuine self-awareness or as behavior change. They knew their patterns and they enacted them anyway. They understood they had wounds and they allowed those wounds to harm you anyway. They could discuss attachment theory and they still destroyed your heart. This recognition that their self-awareness was shallow or that their knowledge didn't translate to change behavior is forcing more honest assessment of how much they actually understand themselves and how much their supposed awareness was actually just intellectualized defense. The avoidant person's self-perception is changing from seeing themselves as someone who is careful about not hurting others to recognizing they're someone whose patterns consistently hurt the people who get closest to them. The avoidant might have prided themselves on being kind, on not wanting to cause harm, on trying to be a good person, but the pattern of destroyed hearts in their wake, culminating in the undeniable recognition of what they did to yours, forces acknowledgement that their intentions don't matter as much as their impact, that being kind in their self-perception doesn't prevent them from being harmful in their patterns, that they are the common denominator in the trail of hurt they've left. This recognition that they consistently hurt people despite believing themselves to be kind is creating crisis in their self-understanding. The avoidant person's self-perception is changing in their understanding of their relationship history, reframing their previous relationship endings from mutual incompatibilities or from partners being too needy to pattern of them destroying hearts through their inability to sustain intimacy. They're looking back at previous relationships with new awareness, recognizing that what they framed as incompatibility or as partners being too demanding might have actually been them causing harm through their patterns, destroying other hearts before yours, leaving trail of wounded people who tried to love them and who were damaged by their inability to receive that love. This reframing of their history is painful because it multiplies their sense of harm they've caused and makes clear that destroying your heart wasn't an isolated incident, but is pattern they've repeated throughout their relational life. The avoidant person's self-perception is changing in a fundamental way that makes them less able to maintain their defended sense of self and more forced to confront who they actually are. Someone whose wounds cause harm, whose patterns destroy hearts, whose lack of healing work has real costs to real people. This more honest self-perception is deeply uncomfortable and is creating crisis that could go one of two directions. Either the avoidant uses this recognition as a wake-up call that motivates genuine therapeutic work and sustained effort to change their patterns, to heal their wounds, to develop capacity to show up differently. Or the avoidant finds this new self-perception too painful to maintain and reconstructs new defensive narratives that allow them to minimize the harm again, to blame circumstances or bad luck, or to simply avoid thinking about what they've done. The first path is rare and difficult, but is the only one that leads to genuine change. The second path is more common and easier, but ensures the pattern repeats with new victim. Why realizing they destroyed your heart doesn't mean they can fix it.